Hiring decisions, especially for early employees, are arguably some of the most critical ones that can make or break a business. Having been on both sides of the table throughout my software career, I've identified and compiled a list of mistakes that I, my colleagues, and my interviewers had made, and want to share them with you. Most of these apply outside software engineering too. This article is relevant for software engineers, product leads, engineering managers, and recruiters who are willing to reflect on their interviewing and hiring experience. I would love to hear your stories and thoughts on the topic too. Before we start, we need a definition of a senior or lead software engineer. In this article, it is someone with substantial technical knowledge who wants to create value and can take on a project and deliver a working solution with their team, respecting the constraints of the business. Basically, someone who can get from point A to point B without traversing the alphabet backward. You will learn more about how I define a senior or lead software engineer as you explore the article further. Expectations. Multiple times, I've received a calendar invite for a 30-minute chat without having any idea about the stage of the process. This can lead to uncomfortable situations and a waste of time when the interviewee expects a friendly get to know each other and perhaps even call in from their tablet, but instead of greeted with several coding challenges they are expected to solve quickly. Talent can easily be pushed away when doing this. Instead, in your invites, communicate the purpose and expectations of every interview stage clearly, allowing the candidate to prepare and join the meeting with a certain level of confidence. I have to say that this mostly happens when a third-party recruiter is involved. This 10% introduction, 85% the interviewer talks about the company and asks questions. And maybe the candidate has 5% of the available time to ask some of their own at the very end. I call these interviews catbird conversations and find them risky for the company. First, senior engineers are often wanted in many places, and they are interviewing you just as much as you are interviewing them, leaving only the last few minutes for questions when everybody is in a rush, and looking at the clock doesn't allow them to interview you, and they might be more hesitant to accept the offer if they would have an alternative. This leads to the second point. When you don't let the candidate speak and ask questions, you won't figure out what is important to them and won't be able to use this information when making the most competitive offer. Read most competitive, not necessarily the highest. Don't get me wrong, it is very important to take time and explain what the candidate will be working on and what kind of collaboration is expected in case they get hired. Once you have aligned on these expectations, let the candidate let at least 20,140% of the conversation and learn from it. Questions such as how do you do this in Java create unnecessary boundaries for the candidate, limiting them in their ability to show knowledge and creativity. Even if you really want to get an answer to your very specific question, this can be done in a smarter way. Start with a broad question, for instance, how would you approach this problem? This way, you create room for learning more about the candidate first, and still have space to narrow down the problem as the conversation progresses, all the way down to your original intended question. Not only will you get what you wanted in the beginning, but also learn about the candidate's thinking process outside of your immediate question, making the conversation both more complete and feel better in general. Know every bit of language syntax code for Python list comprehension. Senior engineers tend to think more about what the code is at a high level, without diving into the details of the language and trying to make a function take 2 lines instead of 4. One of the worst mistakes is assuming the candidate is a bad engineer because they don't know the shorthand coding techniques in the language specific to your project. These candidates typically have solid experience in 2, 3, or even more languages, and bring value by picking the right tool for the job, instead of finding ways to drill a nail into the glass. Instead, check that they have a solid conceptual understanding of software design patterns and up-to-date knowledge of the industry standards, but don't expect them to be experts in your specific tech stack. Path oftentimes, the interviewer focuses solely on the career path of the candidate, asking only about the promotions of the interviewee. While this can help understand how the candidate views certain elements of their past but doesn't touch on the contributions they might have made themselves towards the promotions of others. What could differentiate an engineer from others is their focus on willingness to mentor, coach, and elevate the people around them. Asking questions about how the candidate contributed to the growth of their colleagues helps understand if the candidate is grateful/willing to bring value to other people's lives, elevating them and the organization as a whole. Their knowledge of a specific framework. I witnessed interviewers, being senior engineers themselves, senior within the context of the KIV organization, rejecting candidates due to their lack of in-depth knowledge of Hibernate, C-Release, or some other framework. First of all, this does provide very limited value, because the candidate can be an expert in something similar, and they can learn it quickly. Secondly, this can indicate that the interviewer is biased towards using certain tech, which can be a red flag for the candidate. Instead, check their level of understanding of the semantics of distributed systems by providing an example of a system and asking a broad question such as what can go wrong here. You will be able to judge whether the candidate has a deep understanding of the fundamentals of how computers work and talk to each other. And if they do have these fundamentals in place, they will be able to quickly get up to speed with any framework, and crucially, design truly resilient, scalable, and simple software, making the right trade-offs. The same ideas apply to asking how would you structure the files in this project, versus how would you structure the data for a certain use case and split the code into microservices or functions. The second question creates room for a much broader answer, allowing the interviewer to have a better understanding of the candidate's thinking, instead of narrowing the potential answer down to the specifics of a single tool. The problem: developers are known to be opinionated, surprise, and often favor complex solutions that are seen as challenges. Very rarely is a piece of code so valuable that it needs hardcore resilience built in, because most of us work on web apps and not flight control systems or life support devices. And still, we tend to overcomplicate things, often even without having a single customer upfront or knowing about their actual needs. When the candidate shares their solutions, either to their past problems or those brought up during the interview, always take context into account and try to see whether they created complexity because it was necessary to bring value to the business, or to boost their own resume. Last but not least, ask about their work with a variety of different technologies, but don't expect them to be experts in every single one of them. This way, you will be able to get a feeling for their honesty, integrity, and openness to learning. What you really want is someone with production experience in every layer of the tech stack: backend/frontend, databases, infrastructure, testing, build, automation, monitoring, and documentation. Someone who is honest, open, humble, and always trying their best. Someone you can trust.